Okay, right. So welcome everyone to the Joint Learning Initiative's reading group. Today we're going to hear from Dr. Nina Kurlberg on the Telos of faith-based aid, Christian organizing in development, humanitarianism and advocacy through the lens of institutional logics. Nina has just finished her PhD looking at this very area, and now she is a postdoc in theology and religion at Durham University, and previously worked for Tear Fund, looking at theology for Tear Fund as well. So we're very pleased to have her here today. What we're going to do in this session is we're going to hear from Nina first for about 25 minutes, and then we'll hear for a response from David Westwood at World Vision for about 5 minutes, and then we will turn to open discussion amongst us. So get your questions ready. It'll be fairly informal Q&A at the end. I won't, we'll just be able to unmute and talk amongst ourselves. So I look forward to that. But in the meantime, Nina, over to you. I have the PowerPoint ready, so let me know when you want me to share
Great.
it.
Yeah, will do. Thank you. So thank you so much, Olivia, for organising this. I'm going to assume that most of you have read or at least skimmed through the introduction that was sent round. Is that right? Oh, brilliant. Great. So that sort of gives an overview of my project as a whole. I'm not going to have time. I've got 25 minutes, as Olivia said, so I won't have time to go into all the details of the research, but it's going to be published in, I think, 5 months' time as part of the Religion and Development series at Routledge. So it will be available then. So what I wanted to do in the 25 minutes today was to really focus on introducing my theoretical approach, because really I think that's sort of the main contribution that the research makes to the field of religion and development is actually the approach that it introduces to the field and then models through the case study. So just to give a very brief overview of what I'll do today, first of all, I'll say something about the research aims. Then I'll introduce very briefly this perspective, the institutional logics perspective. Then I'm going to show how I used it in the research, and I'll highlight just a few of the main findings. So to start with the research aims, really the research is situated within the field of faith-based organizations, which, as you know, that sort of, there's aspects of within different fields of study that look at faith-based organizations. And the question really that I wanted to address through the research concerns how faith influences the practice of faith-based development, humanitarian and advocacy NGOs. In terms of faith, though, really because of the case study organization that I looked at, I ended up focusing on Christianity in particular, and geographically my focus was really on the UK. So the case study organization was a UK-based Christian organization. So as I said, I think that the main contribution that the research makes really relates to the theoretical perspective that I bring to the study of faith-based organizations. And if you're a little bit familiar with the literature, you'll be aware that actually various typologies have been constructed over the years that sort of help describe and define faith-based organizations. And so what I did was to import a perspective from institutional theory, that's the institutional logics perspective, and then I used that perspective to develop an analytical tool that actually I think can be adapted to study faith-based organizations. In a moment, I'm going to explain what the value is of this particular tool. But I think I just wanted to say sort of at the outset that my own personal view is that actually it's not a tool that's only useful from an academic perspective, but actually from a practitioner perspective as well. So as part of the initial phase of the research, I carried out a review of different studies of faith-based organizations, particularly those that focused on typologies. And without going into too much details, actually the two key findings really were that an approach to studying faith-based organizations is needed that really acknowledges faith as one factor among several that have a bearing on organizational practice. And secondly, it became clear to me through the study that actually we need to take really seriously one of Tara Heffron's challenges, which is that we need to be conversant across fault lines. We need to take fault lines seriously. And one of these fault lines that she looks at is the macro-micro fault line. And I think given the significance, or given my interest in faith and faith within organizational practice, actually that it was really apparent to me that I needed to use a perspective that actually enabled multi-level analysis, that sort of enabled the interplay between faith-related dynamics at both the individual and organizational levels to be captured. And for me, this is why the institutional logics perspective made a lot of sense. And I hope that sort of as I go through introducing some of the research, that will become obvious. So I'm going to begin with just a very brief introduction to the institutional logics perspective. But the plan is that as I introduce aspects of the research, I'll also be introducing that perspective. So I don't want to dwell too long on the abstract side of this, but I thought it would be helpful for me to provide a little bit of background. So the institutional logics perspective, it's a perspective that emerged out of institutional theory. And as a concept, it sort of came about through a chapter that was written by two scholars, Roger Friedland and Robert Alford, in 1991. And in this chapter, they argued that organizational and institutional theory really needs to pay proper attention to the societal context in which organizational and individual behavior occurs. So their belief was that actually an understanding of context is essential to any understanding of individual and organizational behavior. So for Friedland and Alford, they conceived of society as this interinstitutional system, and the institutions that they look of which society is comprised, they understood these as supra-organizational patterns of activities that shape human behavior and symbolic systems that enable individuals and organizations to order this behavior and to give meaning to this behavior. So just to give an example of what they saw as institutions, one would be religion, another would be market, the professions. So the two things to point out here are really that institutions have both material components and symbolic components. And actually that there's a connection between these sort of higher level institutional orders and organizational individual action. And at the core of these institutions, they conceived of this logic, which has a bearing on an institution's organizing principles. So that was very wordy, but I'm hoping that as we go through, that will become a little bit clearer. So that was sort of this meta-theoretical understanding of institutional logics. And then three scholars came along, I think in the 90s and early 2000s, Patricia Thornton, William Ocasio, and Michael Lounsbury. And they developed this method by which institutional logics can be analysed socioscientifically. And they produced a topology of the logics of what they thought to be the 7 institutional orders that comprise the interinstitutional system, or that comprise society. And these they identified as family, community, religion, state, market, professions, and corporation. And really, it's the work of these latter 3 scholars that informed my approach significantly. So I'm going to move on for now, but as I said, this perspective should become clearer as I sort of introduce it in action. But one of the things that I wanted to say about this approach, which relates to the fact that it enables multi-level analysis, is that actually in my own sort of approach to the PhD research, I started by exploring dynamics at the societal level. And then I narrowed down to sort of exploring dynamics at the field level. And then I focused in on one organization within the field that I'd identified. So, and all the way along, what I was trying to do was to sort of trace the connections between these different analytical levels. So that, in my mind, is actually one of the benefits of this theoretical perspective, is that it really helps to bring this sort of thick understanding of organizational and institutional behavior. So I'm going to say something very briefly about the societal research. I'm the societal level research. I'm not going to go into this in depth today, but essentially that had a historical focus. And the purpose of this was really to gain insight into some of the historical dynamics related to the logics that impact the practice of aid. And this was sort of as a preparatory phase for developing the topology of logics at the field level. So it was sort of setting the research within a broader societal and historical context. So I wonder, Olivia, if you wouldn't mind to sort of show the topology. I'm going to talk about this in a minute, but I thought it might be helpful for you to see what this topology that was developed looks like. So my empirical research, it was in 2 stages. Oops, sorry, I've just got to get back to my notes, just give me a sec, there we go. So it was in two stages. The first stage was to construct a tool at the field level. And as I said, this was developed on the basis of Thornton et al. Societal level tool. And this was a tool that I would be able to use to process and analyze data related to the organizational practice of one case study faith-based organization. So that sort of organizational level analysis. I'm just going to say something very briefly about the field. As you know, I'm sure the field in which development, humanitarian and advocacy organizations operate is very broad, and it encompasses a wide range of organizations. So for the tool to be useful, I really needed to identify a smaller subcomponent of the broader field. And for that, I ended up using the Disasters Emergency Committee member organizations. So the DEC, it's a UK-based group of organizations that enables members to fundraise jointly during humanitarian crises. It consists of 14 member organizations. That was as of 2016 to 18, and that's when I conducted this stage of the research. And the case study organization is included in this. And this was a fitting group of organizations for the empirical research because the DEC organisations in the UK, they're all influential actors within the sector. They've got very high status. And my interest was in the larger organisations on account of this status, and also because they play a significant role in shaping practice within the sector and conceptions of legitimacy and things like that. So this small group of 14 organisations was the field. It was sort of, yeah, the group of organisations that I used to develop the analytical tool that you can see on the screen. So this topology of logics was the one that was developed through the research. It's a field level tool, and it's based on ideal types. And I'm going to come to ideal types in a moment. I wish I had time to explain this in more detail, but I don't. So I'm going to have to keep it really brief. But Thornton, Ocasio, and Lounsbury, who the three scholars that I referred to earlier, they conceptualized the institutional logics perspective as a matrix. So as you'll see, they place the institutional orders on the x-axis, and the y-axis, they place these categories, which they see sort of as building blocks that represent the cultural symbols and material practices that are particular to each order. So you'll see their source of authority, source of legitimacy, decision-making. Actually, that was one of mine, decision-making processes. But they sort of developed the idea of these sort of y-axis categories. And so really you could say that actually for each institutional order, the content of these y-axis categories represents their logic. It's really important to note here that actually the y-axis categories, they're not definitive, and they can be expanded or amended depending on the context that you're looking at. But I think specifying categories like this, according to which institutional logics can be seen in action, actually enables us to analyze how the logics impact practice. As you'll see also from this table, I chose to focus only on 4 institutional orders. And that was just sort of for practical reasons, just because it would have been too much, I think, to look at more. But I chose the ones that I found to be most prevalent within organizational practice. So corporation, market, religion, and community. In order to build this topology, I actually began with the existing theory and literature, which was focused at the societal level, as I said. And then I sort of explored the application of this within my specific field of interest. So those 14 organizations. And I think the question that was underlying the development of each logic was, what would one expect an organization within the field's practice to be if it was influenced only by the logic of corporation or the logic of market or religion? So to put this in another way, what are the sets of expectations within the fields that are connected to each of these logics? But the development of this topology was also steered as, so not only the historical survey that I mentioned, but also initial interviews that I conducted within the DEC member organizations and several sets of documents that I studied. So it was job advertisements, it was annual reports, the web pages of these organizations. So it was sort of a combination of theory, literature, and sort of documents and interviews that inform the development of this topology. What I wanted to point out, I said that I'd say something about ideal types, and that's really that each of these logics that you see on the screen there, they're ideal types. And what's really important to bear in mind about ideal types is that they're neither descriptive nor analytical. So instead, an ideal type is an abstraction from reality, and it presents ideal behavior that actually is not expected to occur. But the reason why ideal types like this are developed in a useful and socioscientific analysis is that actually they enable you to hold together sort of, or to hold in tension those broader dynamics that's represented by the behavior, and then the specificity of individual situations. And so the ideal type, it can do this because it's very general in its construction, but it's used as a point of reference against which specific characteristics of individual situations can be compared, and then the differences accounted for. The other thing that I wanted to highlight is actually logics are not mutually exclusive. So there's always more than one in action at any time. But actually what this tool does, it enables them to be separated for the purposes of analysis. So that's sort of the topology. And I'm going to move on now to say something about the case study. So that was sort of the first part of the research, was developing, or after the survey, the historical survey, was sort of developing this topology of logics that was operating at the field level. And that, yeah, so that was sort of about translating Thornton et al.'s societal level topology into one specific context. And then in the second stage, I collected and processed data through interviews within the UK National Office of an international non-governmental FBO. And this organisation, as I said, was also a DEC member organisation. And there were several questions that I set out to address, and I haven't got time to go into them, but I'll just briefly mention them. So I was asking what institutional logics are enforced within the organisation, how are they manifested within the organisation, how do individual actors negotiate them on a daily basis, and then sort of looking more specifically at religion, what roles does the logic of religion play, and how does it interact with other institutional logics? And then what I did was I used the topology of logics to analyze the interview transcripts. So I carried out, it was 8 formal in-depth interviews. And then in the following years, I sort of had follow-up conversations, and that was with people that I'd interviewed already, and then additional past and present staff members. And then as well, I had some conversations with the organisation again, just to sort of check the findings and check the topology and things like that. So this table, so that's the topology of logics. And then on the next slide, I don't know if you would be happy to share that, Olivia. Thank you. So this table here sort of shows how logics are expressed in an operation at the organizational level within the case study organization. What I wanted to say here is that actually, and this is something I make clearer in the manuscript, but I don't have time to go into it now, is that actually there are variations across different organizational functions. So if you're looking at, for example, a policy and programs team versus your marketing team versus your theology department, etc. So there were variations across organizational functions, but what I've done in this table is to sort of show what emerged as dominant through the empirical research. So the table shows both the manifestation of logics at the organizational level, and then whether through the research I saw, coexistence, conflation, or conflict between the logics in each category. There's not going to be time to focus on the whole table, but I will share a little bit about some of the findings that emerged through the process. So I'm going to there's a reason why I looked at sort of coexistence, conflation, and compatibility, but I haven't got time to go into that, but I will say a little bit about each of those points. So points of coexistence, really that's where logics coexist in their original form. And a good example here would be that category source of legitimacy. So really it became clear that actually the needs of the community are the ultimate source of the organization's legitimacy, because actually they're the reason for the organization's existence. But for many of those that I spoke with, actually in responding to these needs, the organization is responding to God's call. So in the words of one interviewee, actually the organization's mission derives from our faith and what we feel Jesus is calling us to do as individuals, and what we should get together corporately to do as well. And this same individual remarked in relation to recruitment that actually they saw that people had come to the organisation with callings, sort of used the language of calling specifically. And then later in the organisation, the same interviewee commented that actually the organisation had recently felt more of a call to the most vulnerable communities in the world and the world's toughest places. So they were talking on the one hand about sort of the needs of the community, and then at the same time about this need to respond to God's call. So the logics of religion and community were very closely interlinked, and I thought they coexisted. The next sort of points that I looked at were the points of conflation, and that's where logics merge. And a good example here would be in relation to mission. So in practice, the organization's mission is to achieve the greatest possible impact in relation to the cause. So whereas at the sort of field level topology, actually, I don't know, Olivia, would you mind to go back to that slide quickly, please? That might be helpful. You'll see that the mission is to sort of increase income, efficiency, and profit. That would be according to a market logic. Or according to a community logic, it's to act in service of the community. But sorry, if you just wouldn't mind going back to, yeah, then we'll stay here. Thank you. But actually in practice, the focus within the organization was on maximizing impact rather than profit. So that's just an example where two logics have conflated in practice. And then the final points that I was looking at was points of conflict. So it became really clear that the points of tension within the organization actually relate to those places where institutional logics are incompatible with each other, but also both central to organizational practice. So there are two examples that I'll mention here, but one is in relation to decision-making process. So on the one hand, there's this drive for efficiency and top-down decision-making. But on the other hand, because of the influence of the community, the logic of community, there's this real strong drive towards consensus building and participation. And I sort of show through the chapter how this stems from the logic of community, where decision-making is community-led. And both of these things are actually central to the way that the organization operates. But in practice, there were points at which they become incompatible because you've just either got to make, because of the need for, efficiency, you've got to make resource decisions quickly, etc. But then also, I guess, particularly there's this drive for community-led decision-making, consensus building, participation, particularly because there's a huge focus at the moment on power and the way that power operates in practice. So that's sort of decision-making. Another example was in relation to recruitment priorities. So, and this concerns the logic of religion and the logic of corporation. Again, they're both central to practice, yet can be incompatible at times. So within the organization, certain roles have, it's called a genuine occupational requirement for the post holder to have an active Christian faith. And there are criteria against which roles are assessed to see whether they have this it's called a GOR in short or not. So that's line managers, it's externally facing members of staff and things like that. And the source of tension is really that it concerns prioritization. If in an interview process, actually none of the candidates that you're interviewing have, both on the one hand, necessary skills, competence, experience, as well as an active faith, what do you prioritize? So I found that although across organizational practice as a whole, actually the logic of religion is for the most part compatible with the logic of corporation because it plays a sort of supporting role rather than a dominant role. Actually, the tension in relation to recruitment occurs because, there is this requirement for the GOR, for an active Christian faith, and then religion moves to a position of dominance, but it's sometimes incompatible because actually there's also this drive for, wanting people that can do their job and do their job well, right? And there were several examples that emerged in the interviews of unsuccessful recruitments because either because active faith was prioritized over the proven track record, or because proven track record was prioritized over active faith, and people found that they couldn't work in an overtly Christian environment. One of the things that I did want to point out, because this is quite important in terms of the research findings, is actually the points at which there's the greatest tension within the organization, decision-making process and recruitment priorities actually relate to the corporate telos of long-term sustainability on account of its requirement for efficiency in relation to decision-making processes, and on account of the need to prioritize hiring staff that have this proven track record. So one of my key findings was actually the significance of this telos within organizational practice. And I found that telos was as important for the organization as motivations, values, and beliefs. The final thing that I wanted to say before we move to David's response is that in relation to my primary research question, although important insights emerged through the interviews, it actually was very difficult for the organization to articulate precisely how its Christian identity is actively and concretely expressed in practice. So it was a question that emerged as actually being really significant for the organization. And it was clear that the organization had adopted corporate practices and that this was clearly for the sake of the long-term sustainability of the organization. But it was clear that there was also this Christian identity that was really important and that I could see play out within practice, particularly at the individual level. So as I said, actually, these points of tension concern the action of faith, that concern the action of faith were actually related to this telos of the logic of corporation, which was the long-term sustainability of the organization. And I think, while it was really clear the logic of religion was of critical importance, it was one of the main purposes of the organization's existence. There's tension when that sort of Telos of the logical corporation of long-term sustainability is dominant, but seemingly incompatible with the logic of religion. And I think that's always sort of at a practical level going to be a potential source of tension within faith-based organizations, particularly in organizations like this, where the corporate logic is quite dominant within organizational practice. And I think the reason for this is because, while the telos of the logic of religion, which is to worship God, transcends the organization, actually the telos of the logic of corporation is the organization itself. So organizational practices actually have to work to sustain the organization. And so I found that actually at that organizational level, faith is restricted to certain spaces and forms. So your weekly devotion sessions, your daily prayers, prayer at the start of meetings, prayer before decisions and things like that. It was restricted to certain spaces at the organizational level, but actually at the individual level, it was dominant and it was active, and it played a really key role in helping individuals to manage tensions that they were facing at work. So it provided resources for people to deal with some of those sort of everyday tensions, and other things like that. So really the sort of key argument that I advanced through the book is that actually the influence of faith at the organizational level predominantly relates to the process of organizing. And so I think that's where I'll stop, because I've talked and I waffled a bit at the end there, but we'll hear from David now and then we can chat.
Okay, thank you very much, Nina. So let me try and switch to our response. So we're going to hear from David Westwood, who is Director of Policy and Programmes at World Vision UK. David has not been able to join us here today, so he has kindly sent a video. And let me just make sure that this will work. Nina, can you give me the thumbs up if you hear the sound? If not, no. Okay, I need to just, excuse me, everyone. No. Okay, I'm sorry. Apologies, everyone. Um, I think that if we could switch to the Q&A, and go straight into that, and I just need to double check something, and then we will play David's response. So let's just pivot quickly. Okay, so thanks again, Nina. So we've heard Nina's presentation on the telos of faith-based aid. I can also share the screen again if we need to see her PowerPoints. But we're now open to questions and answers. Since we're a small enough group, I really just encourage everyone to unmute as you see fit, and we will talk amongst ourselves. So we are now open to questions and answers. So if anyone would like to go first, please go ahead.
Nina, it's Alistair here. Thanks ever so much for the presentation, which I really enjoyed, and it is encouraging me towards the book. I guess I've got two or three questions, but I'll just try and focus on one to get things started. I suppose um, partly by my own constitution, I'm interested in difference, in distinction, and I'm partly then interested in what you might have found with other organizations within this framework and contrasts. But probably within your own data, you hinted at the difference within departments and roles, essentially, and almost thinking of this analysis almost as a diagnostic tool for organizational development of where the logics are potentially conflicting or conflating. So I suppose that's the first question: is how you see it as potentially an analytical tool for reflection and practice within an organization, or potentially, if it was used across organizations, a comparative understanding of these dynamics. But that does link slightly to a second question, which I will throw in, is the extent to which these are performative logics, in the sense that there's an audience for which this logic is presented. Obviously, funders, but also at recruiting, and whether you felt that notion of these logics being, in a sense, rehearsed and presented to an audience was something that you felt in your analysis.
Yeah, thank you. There's some really good questions there, and I tried to make some notes so I don't forget the ones that you asked there. So difference and distinction. I mean, so the one that really comes to mind, and this is sort of from experience of working in several different organizations, would be, for example, between your brand and communication department and your theology department, for example, where the theologians are operating more according to the normative and ethical precepts or whatever, and your brand and comms actually have to raise money and sell. So that came across in one of the organizations I talked with, and they were sort of talking about how, you know, this is the sort of work that ethically they want to do. And when they had the conversation with the comms department, they're saying, well, this just won't sell, or we just can't compete for a big grant for that, because that doesn't seem like it needs lots of money. You know, you're more sort of grassroots work or whatever it is. So that's definitely somewhere that I would say I've seen those points of tension. And that sort of relates to what you were then asking about, you know, the diagnostic tool aspect, is that actually I think it helps with communication within organizations potentially. Because as me, someone who works in a theology team, if I can understand why the brand and comms is asking me for this, then in a sense I can work with them a little bit better. Because so in a sense you could not that you avoid those points of tension, but you actually have that understanding of where people are coming from. Whereas when you don't have any of that, as a theologian, it might be really obvious as to why you would take XYZ decision, or as to someone who's, you know, worked in communications and then come to this sector, and maybe even to a faith-based organization for the first time, it's not so obvious, is it? So definitely something there about cross-organizational communication, I would say. I don't know if that sort of answers that first part of your question.
Well, it does in a way, but it just strikes me that the insight there is a really potentially very important one, of the sense, thinking of the organizational pragmatics, that these logics don't necessarily need to be set as competitive, but often within organizations, they are seen as competitive, that the theology team is offended of the branding messaging and feels it's corrupted that, or the branding team gets irritated. And somehow, whether the framing helps the dialogue and reflection within an organization to see that these logics are not necessarily incompatible, but they are somehow layered and related. So I think that's very helpful in that respect, to foster some of those discussions around where there appears to be difference, but the extent to which they can I really what your term was, but they can conflate, or at least they're not necessarily in competition.
Yeah, I think so. I really think so. I think not all those tensions have to be resolved, but it's also about understanding where the really important points of tension are. And so one of the examples that is in the manuscript, that it relates to sort of a big grant that was offered that had to be turned down because it didn't cover the admin cost. But then on the other hand, there were people saying, well, actually, we need to help these people, and we've been offered potentially £5 million. Why can't we accept the grant? So I think, you know, in ways like that. So some of these tensions probably do have to be resolved either way, but it just helps you, I think, to be able to do that if you can understand what's at the root of that tension.
Can I just nudge on to that latter point, Nina? Because I think it flows just and it's the extent, I guess, a logic seems it's deep within an organization or it's within the value structure. But my sort of thought that they're performative suggests that they are fluid and that you pitch a logic to an audience knowing what that audience needs. And there's a degree of pragmatics in that. I wondered if you felt over time that you were seeing logics as sort of fundamental within the identity of an organization, or in this sense, a fluidity of them being of a performative nature for a particular audience to present a logic of the organization's work to that audience and its values.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I was going to come on to that because I think there's definitely something of the performative, but I think I was sort of looking at external and internal as well. So I think there's the externally facing, and one of the ways that I saw that, so when I was doing that sort of field level research, really in the appeals, so organizations appeals for funding. There was a lot of, for some people, sort of appeals to communities, and they're showing their sort of really deep connection with communities. So there was, so in a sense, I guess it comes down to that sort of identity of the market identity of anything sells, because really the purpose of the appeal was to get funding, and you really saw that. So whatever sells, that's what you would see in an organization's appeal, right? And that changes over time. Or in a job ad, really it was trying to show, well, we're a great organization to work for, and this is why. And that's just pragmatic, you have to do that. But then I think there's another aspect which is more the internal, and that relates to your sort of values and beliefs. And that I wouldn't say is, I don't know, I guess it depends how you define performative, but though, they're really deeply held values. And even, among those that I spoke with that weren't of faith themselves, but this drive for sort of justice that was really deeply rooted in individuals working for organizations. So I'd say it's both. It's not just performative, but it's looking at the context of whatever document you're, studying.
Thanks so much, Nina. That's really helpful.
Hi, Nina, this is Stephen. I'm actually based here in Nairobi. So my question for you, and let me tell you the 2 points that I'm coming at this from, because I don't think this is going to be a clear question. So maybe if I couch it in where I'm coming from, it will make more sense. So my PhD research was looking at Kenyan churches, so Kenyan Christian institutions, and how they model democracy. So there's like a whole organizational, institutional logic in that space. So part of my head is there. The other part of my head is coming from doing an evaluation of one of Tear Fund's leadership programs in here across Africa. So I'm curious about what you're finding. How much of it do you think can go outside of the UK and go into other parts of the world? Because sometimes I feel like I love Africa, but sometimes I feel like the logic-free zone, excels here from that institutional framework. And when I dove in and my research was finding, oh my word, there's a whole other way of thinking about organizational culture. The performative bit was there, but it was more a very personal performative element of how do I weave my way through Tear Fund, then World Vision, then Save the Children. And it's all in that sort of space. It's a calling, but I'll stop babbling there to just see what you think from a non-UK perspective.
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. And I think actually that's something identified as needing further research, which is to what extent does this actually work? There have been studies of logics in other contexts. So there are people that have actually used. So I think that's the thing about the perspective is I think it's flexible enough to be adapted and used in different contexts, particularly in contexts where you might have that. So if you're talking about, for example, Tear Fund, World Vision, Save the Children in an African context, often some of those logics would have just been sort of imported through the organizational structures that are imported. So there's an element of that. And then there's how is that then shaped by the context that it's in? And I guess that's not an area that I have experience. And I know that people are doing some of that work, but I think that would be a really interesting area of research as to what extent is it applicable or is it not?
Exactly. And I think there would be a layered that would be applicable, because I think, speaking from, say, a Kenyan perspective, the population has learned to play both games. There's the institutional logic that is required by TFR and World Vision. They can work in that space, but if you ask them, we need to get this done, it might not go through the logistical, channels of how World Vision should do something, and they go do it a more culturally. Oh, I know this person who knows this person, and so I do work in evaluation. So I'm working for various organizations doing, as I said, with Tear Fund, but with World Vision, Save the Children, the Catholic Church. And that's like a whole nother sort of space with how the Catholic development organizations work as well. So yeah, I'm looking forward to diving into this more and just seeing what components can you pull out, because the funders are often looking for these sort of frameworks to kind of help assess the process. How did the development occur? And what were the factors at play there? So yeah, I'll look forward to, I don't know, is it in publication, or what's the status of beyond the chapter, the intro that was shared?
Yeah, so I delivered the manuscript last week, so I think we're looking at summertime at some point.
Okay, good.
Can I jump on the backs of that, actually? Hi, Nina. I'm familiar with this research, and I find it absolutely fascinating and quite confusing. So that's maybe just my premise. But I've been thinking about two things lately, and today's presentation, I feel like, brought these two things kind of together. And so bear with me as I try to process this. And one is, when I look at NGO studies and the study of the third sector as a sector, it really feels like the unit of the NGO as like an actual sector, as a unit of analysis, is kind of dying. The era of the NGO is ending. So I work for World Vision as the Senior Research Advisor for Faith and Development. And in my role with World Vision lately, I've been spending a lot of effort helping World Vision develop its narrative around how, as a Christian NGO, we help children experience God's love without trying to convert them to Christianity, respecting diversity, religious traditions, but yet we still believe that all children should experience God's love. It's been a really interesting and fun exercise trying to give definition to that. And where it has led me is into the space of thinking, maybe 30, 40, 50 years from now, SAVE, CARE, Oxfam, they're not going to exist anymore because the NGO sector is dying. But if World Vision does a good job of kind of reasserting itself as a Christian organization, as opposed to as a development organization, it might be one of the few survivors. So when you were talking today about kind of the community logic and the business logic, I apologize if I'm using the wrong terms. It kind of occurred to me that, the community logic is kind of like that we're religious side, and the business is a little bit more like we're that development side. And I guess my question is, do you think my thinking is headed in the right direction, or am I totally off base, I guess?
Thanks. You mean in terms of those two logics, the community logic versus
and that ultimately the one that's going to survive the test of time is the religious narrative, as opposed to the utilitarian, for lack of a better word, narrative.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that sort of makes me think even of a lot of the conversations we have at the moment about decolonization, right? Mm-hmm. And so I guess ultimately we would be seeing that the NGO sector would, ultimately you're supposed to be doing yourself out of a job, right? So I guess my hesitation is I don't really know what sort of time frame we're looking at. I don't know if others here have other views on that, but I think I would see that ultimately, I probably would agree with you, but I'm just not sure. I don't know if that makes sense. What sort of time frame are we talking about?
I was going to say then the connection to that question is then if that's where we're going, then even if the community logic is difficult to justify in the short term, is it actually a better long-term strategy? I guess that's my ultimately. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think so. I think the problem is the need for the market logic. And I think about where I'm trying to think through some of the conversations I've had about points of tension. It's that ultimately it's not necessarily that we don't want to go with consensus building and participation, which takes more time because you've got to negotiate with however many people rather than just make a decision yourself. The point is that actually the market logic is pushing us in this certain direction because we're just resource restricted, right? So if this isn't financially viable, we can't do it. And if we're saying we can't do this because it's financially viable, are we able to spend X amount of time having decisions and meetings and conversations about, so I think you're always weighing up these different approaches implied by the different logics. And I think at the moment, I would say our climate is, I don't know how others feel, but I think we're quite a resource, there's a lot of restrictions on resources at the moment. And I think that is affecting things. Yeah.
So that's really helpful because actually, I guess as you say it that way, I think actually it is the market logic that still wins out. It's just a different market. And because a lot of what we're doing in terms of justifying this Christian narrative is because we think, in the long run, it's, 20 years from now, it's still going to be, sorry, we're among friends, the American evangelicals that pay our bills.
Yeah, thank you.
Right. And I'm wondering if there's also a tension in the market, I think, right? Like there are people, you talked a little bit about the tension between secular and religious, and that in my American context, in my, young Gen Xers, older millennials, who are becoming the main donor base eventually, there are a lot of people who want to have more, right? They don't necessarily want to define it or have institutional particularities around it, but also want to have evidence-based, impactful storytelling. And so, and then there's also a big base that is super connected to their religious faith and need it to be a certain kind of theological perspective. So I'm wondering about how theology plays a role in assessing the market, but also in assessing practitioners and how they relate to community. I think there are tensions, even in our organization, that, we've been working. We work in the Episcopal Church. There are many people originally started working there because they were Episcopalian. They were drawn by their faith. But over time, as we to expand and get more practitioners, not all of them are religious, not all of them. So then there's this tension between how much Episcopal, how much Anglican, how much religion, how we want to be honoring different faith perspectives. How do we open up the space to do that? So I think there are tensions happening, and I'm wondering how we hold space for all of that to happen at the same time. Because I don't think that the answer is we go more here, we go more here. I think there is a place of, we know our lane, this is our lane, and I will walk with you, but like, this is our lane. And I think right now, too many NGOs are trying to be everything for everyone. And so, instead of being like, this is what we know how to do, how do we walk with you in the other stuff? So maybe that wasn't the question, but that was what was coming up for me in those comments.
Yeah, thank you. And that's a really helpful observation. And I feel like, I still feel like there's something about the tool that would enable a sort of deeper understanding of those contexts. And I think, at least from my experience, the way that people, even the tensions within different theological positions and denominations, that's different across different organizations, depending on who's in your organization and who the organization is working with. But the first point is actually to try and understand the dynamics, trying to understand what's at the root of those points of tension. But yeah, that was a really helpful observation. Thank you.
I did figure out how to play the video. I just didn't press the very obvious button I should have pressed. So if everyone will excuse me, let's try again so that we can hear from David at least.
My name's David Westwood. I work for World Vision as Director of Policy and Programmes. And it's a pleasure just to be able to share a few words with you. This whole issue of faith and development has been one that's really fascinating to me, and one, to be honest, that we've been wrestling with as an organisation for as long as I'm aware, as long as I started, which is 30 odd years ago. And I think the debate comes from the fact that Ultimately, the work that we do, we hope, in a way, witnesses to the love of God for the world. And so if it's supposed to be a witness, then to some degree it has to stand out. It has to say something different. And so this desire, this search for, well, what is it that is different that would point to God's love above and beyond just kind of regular doing good deeds. And if you look externally, then what difference does it make externally? Ultimately, you also look at the organization. What needs to be in place internally for us then to be able to play it out externally? So the values of the organization, how we live them out, and ultimately then also who is part of the organization and what the ask is of them in terms of reflecting those values and the behaviors that align with it. Anyway, I just wanted to say, make 3 points maybe on Nina's work. First of all, it's been really, really useful in terms of explaining some of the things we've been wrestling with for a while. You know, why is change so difficult for us? Why do certain decisions really fail to get traction and get resistance across the organization, those kind of things. And I think the understanding the different logics at play, both within the organization, but also within individuals within the organization is really key, because you can start to see where those tensions are going to be. And it explains some of the things we haven't really been able to put our finger on for a while. And I think so the second point is, well, is that helpful beyond explaining? I think it is, because if you understand it, then you can start designing, for example, your internal communications in a way that resonates across the different logics and brings coherence to the logics, rather than allows kind of fractures to happen. You know, so in change management, I mean, we're thinking at this very minute about how we communicate some change to staff, to be able to think through the different logics and construct a narrative that is reconciling is really important. And I think also then the issue of how you engage with individual staff, and when you're looking at recruitment, bringing staff in, you know, what logics do they hold, and how do their logics fit, and are they likely to resonate, or are there going to be some logics that really are going to be difficult to reconcile as they come into the organization? So, you know, essentially really practical as you start to think through those kind of things. I think the last point I'd like to make really is one about the logics themselves. They're not static, but they're always kind of engaging with each other, arm wrestling, kind of negotiating, and they evolve into new logics or new formulations of logics. And I was thinking, for example, about the whole narrative of impact, you know, which has emerged a bit more recently. And you think, well, actually, impact helps because it resonates from a market perspective. You know, you get your impact investments now and those kind of things, which are much more kind of commercial oriented, but it bridges the gap then with kind of the mission, or the kind of the impact that we want to make in the lives of children, and talking the language of impact kind of creates a third or overarching logic that allows for that reconciliation. And I think it's precisely in this interface between the logics and the wrestling of the faith logic with the other logics that actually you actually maintain some degree of relevance to how faith plays itself out, both within the organization, but more importantly within the context in which we operate and in the world. So anyway, really fascinating. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, and I'm really sorry to be missing out on the conversation. Thank you.
Well, I think David just summed up a lot of what we've been talking about in the Q&A anyway. So a little bit of a different way round than our usual structure. Apologies for that, but I think it brings us to a good close. So thank you very much, Nina, for your presentation. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us and the conversation. We look forward to Nina's book coming out sometime in the summer, and seeing more about this application of institutional logics. And also this video will be available. So if you want to share with colleagues to see, you know, the tables that Nina laid out again, that will be available too. But in the meantime, I think we will we're coming up to the end of the hour, so we'll bring this to a close for now, and say thank you very much, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.